Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the Calc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now in today's video, I wanted to talk about the topic of toxic masculinity. Is toxic masculinity a thing? Does the Bible talk about toxic masculinity? What does the Bible teach us about masculinity? All this is what I want to cover in this video. So to start with, is toxic masculinity a thing? I want to say yes, but it really depends what you mean by that. I think toxic masculinity, as in men being bad men, is yes, definitely a thing. It can also be toxic femininity, where women are bad women, but for the moment I'm just going to talk about toxic masculinity. Yes, there is such a thing as toxic masculinity. And I'm going to talk about this in this video about what exactly that looks like. But before I do, I wanted to just address the problem that emerges from your liberal, lefty, wokey kind of people, where they like to use this term toxic masculinity, and generally they associate toxic masculinity with traditional masculinity, which is what I'm going to call biblical masculinity, chivalry. You know, the leftists, these woke leftists, have this idea where it's like, if a husband works and provides for his family as the breadwinner, that's toxic masculinity. Or if a man opens a door for a woman, that's toxic masculinity. If a man pulls out a chair for a woman, that's toxic masculinity. If a man is the head of his household and his wife is said to submit to a husband, that's toxic masculinity. That's what the left says. But that's not correct. That's actually biblical, traditional, God-pleasing masculinity. The Bible makes it clear that husbands are the head of the household. Wives are to submit to their husbands. And husbands are to be the breadwinners. They are told to provide for their families. Husbands are told to nourish and cherish their wives. To be the protectors. That's actually biblical, traditional, God-pleasing masculinity. But is there such a thing as toxic masculinity? And yes, there is, and this is even addressed in the Bible in the same places where Paul talks about good masculinity. See, particularly in Ephesians chapter 5, Colossians chapter 3, and 1 Peter chapter 3 as well, you see Peter and Paul giving these table of duties. In these sections, they talk about how husbands and wives are to relate to each other, how citizens and governments are to relate to each other, how servants and masters or employees and employers are to relate to each other, and how children and parents are to relate to each other. And in these passages, you do find the passages where Paul and Peter establish this biblical principle, or at least teach us this biblical principle which was established by God in creation, that the man or the husband is the head of the household, that there is male headship and female subordination. Women are commanded to be subordinate to the husbands and to listen to the husbands. Yet even Peter and Paul know that this kind of biblical principle can be greatly corrupted by ungodly, selfish, and toxic men doing a toxic masculinity. Because Paul follows up. After he tells women to submit to their husbands, he then goes, well, hold on, husbands. You make sure you love your wife. You make sure that you sacrifice yourself for your wife and your children in the same way that Christ sacrifices himself for the church. In Ephesians, Paul tells husbands to protect their wives, to cherish them, to nourish them, and to lay down their lives for their wives. And in Colossians, Paul adds that husbands are not to be harsh with their wives. And St. Peter also says that husbands should be patient and understanding and respectful with their wives. Now, many of the woke lefties don't like this idea of men being in charge, men being the heads. But they need to draw the distinction between a good head and a bad head. And this is the distinction between a good, benevolent government and a tyrannical dictator. You don't want government ruling with an iron fist and just taking everything away from their citizens, taxing them into oblivion, not caring for their citizens. And likewise, you don't want a husband treating their family like that. And so the Bible does talk about a toxic masculinity, but toxic masculinity is not what the left calls toxic. What the left calls toxic is traditional masculinity. Now, they would also call toxic masculinity, but they've also conflated toxic masculinity and traditional masculinity. The left like to think that if you say, husband be the head of the household, that you're supporting beating women. Or that if you say wives must be submissive to their husbands, you're supporting domestic violence. This is what the left thinks. They conflate traditional masculinity with toxic masculinity. Now the Bible is clear. There is such thing as a toxic, abusive masculinity. But that's from people not practicing proper biblical traditional masculinity. See, there's a great quote from Spider-Man that says, with great power comes great responsibility. See, men are the heads of their household. They have a great authority, a great power, but with that comes a great responsibility. They actually have to sacrifice themselves for their family. They need to protect and to cherish and to look after their family, to provide for their family, to be a good husband to their family. Great power, great responsibility. Toxic masculinity is great power and no responsibility. When a man is selfish, when he just does whatever he wants, when he's abusive, when he's violent, when he is harsh, when he isn't patient. That is toxic. However, on the flip side, there is another type of toxic masculinity on the opposite end of the spectrum, and that's actually what the woke lefties likes to promote as good masculinity. See, the left likes to promote this effeminate masculinity, where men basically submit to women. These, girly men, as we might call them, where men are weak, men are submissive to women, where women get to be in charge. Real, hardcore radical feminism. That's what the left wants to promote. And they call that good masculinity, but that is actually also toxic masculinity, because that is not how God created it. God created men to be providers and protectors. God created men to be strong and to look after their wives. God did not create men to be, lapdogs and pushovers and allow the women to run the show. A great example from this in scripture is the account of King Ahab and his wife Queen Jezebel. In that situation, Queen Jezebel wore the pants in that relationship. Ahab was, a girly man. He was weak. He was effeminate. Not in the sense that he was like putting on makeup and behaving like a woman. He was effeminate in the sense that he was weak and allowed his wife to boss him around. It was because of her being the boss that Israel fell into such great paganism under his rule. And the best story that demonstrates the weakness of Ahab is the account of Naboth's vineyard. So what happens is Ahab wants to buy Naboth's vineyard and turn it into a vegetable garden. And there is a lot of theological implications with that, but the main point is he wanted the vineyard for a garden, and Naboth said no. And rather than Ahab just going, oh well, I couldn't get it, I'll move on with my life, he went home and he sooked. He sulked. He went to his bed, he says he was vexed, and then he wouldn't eat, and he just lay in bed, cranky, refusing to talk to anyone, refusing to eat or drink, and just sulking. And then his wife comes in and essentially says, be a man, man up, and go and take the vineyard. And he doesn't. He lies there and he continues to sulk. So she takes his signet ring, signs a fake letter, so she signs a letter in his name, and arranges this whole situation that ends up with getting Naboth killed. So you see here this toxic masculinity of Ahab, not in being some kind of controlling, domineering, abusive husband, but by being a weak man, by allowing his wife to rule the roost and do whatever she wanted. And it led to great chaos in the nation of Israel. So you actually have toxic masculinity on these two ends of the spectrum, on weak men who don't lead, and then these strong men who are abusive in their leadership. That is the two ends of the spectrum, and those two extremes are toxic masculinity. We need to find the happy middle ground where a man is a strong leader, but he is also a gentle leader. I remember someone once explaining it to me like this. It's like holding a baby chicken in your hand. If anybody who ever lived on a farm knows, if you want to hold onto a chicken, you need to have a firm grip because they're a little wiggly thing, and if you don't hold onto them, they're going to get out your hand and run off and you've lost your chicken. So you need to have a tight, firm grip. However, this thing is a little baby bird in your hands. If you have too strong of a grip, you will crush the thing to death. So you can't be too firm because you'll crush it, but you also need to be firm enough that it doesn't get away. And that is what traditional biblical masculinity is like. You need to be firm but gentle at the same time. Do not be so firm and overbearing that you crush and destroy, but do not be so weak that you allow things to just fall apart and get away. Have a firm but gentle hold. That is true masculinity. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.